Uh, Hello, fellow G.I. Joe fanatics and children of the 80s or above. Today we're going to talk about a subject of what is canon in G.I. Joe. What could you consider canon? And the real debate comes between, is it the cartoon or the comic book? This is all the story that matters, right? This is the story that we consider the official line of G.I. Joe. Can you have that with G.I. Joe when there are so many diverging versions of G.I. Joe in movies and comic books and several different comic books and several different cartoons? Well, I think we can all agree that screw the movies because those things suck. And then if we're going to go with the comic book, we got to go with the Larry Hama verse. But I think the Larry Hama comic book's main competitor then is the cartoon, right? Now, for a lot of us, that might have been our real doorway into G.I. Joe, was the cartoon. So I'm here to talk about, where does the canon come from for G.I. Joe? What should we consider the most important storyline? What I'm here to do is to talk about, and maybe we can continue in the comments here. What do you think? What's more important, the cartoon or the comic book? And so let's compare them. I think we have to look at a bunch of different factors of what should be considered really canon here and what's the most important thing in the G.I. Joe storyline. First thing we're going to compare is sci-fi light versus batshit crazy fantasy. Comic book, we get a version of G.I. Joe that is, I would call it sci-fi light, okay? Meaning that while there are definitely science fiction elements, you have Flash has a laser rifle that, can cut through walls. Serpentor is, a DNA creation that eventually comes up in the cartoon and the comic book. And we have vehicles that don't work in real life, trouble bubbles and, pogos and, bats, battle android troopers that we don't have in real life. Sure. And then in the cartoon, we get like fatal fluffies and...
Oh, how adorable. Oh, they're so cute.
And mind control devices and, giant mech robots and, portals to other dimensions and, basically every kind of weird fantasy, bizarro idea you can think of, that cartoon hits it. And I think that's one of the things that I love about that cartoon, actually, having rewatched and see if it holds up. I wanted to see if it doesn't hold up. And, a lot of the things that's so great about the cartoon is it is so wildly inventive. Like, I think if you watch a lot of cartoons from the day, I'm going to give the cartoon a little bit of... You watch a lot of these cartoons from the day, they do not hold up. They're really kiddie entertainment that is... still kiddie entertainment. I'm not trying to say that this is like highbrow shit or something. I'm just saying it's really, very, very kiddie. Like, try to watch He-Man right now. It's hard. Okay, it's hard. It's just, get through one episode. It's rough. But you watch this stuff, it's so weird. It's so wildly inventive. They were just throwing things at the wall. It's just like, it's almost Twilight Zone like. There's cult, entire towns are become cults. There's portals to other worlds. There's, Game Master. There's everything you can think of. And it's absolutely batshit crazy. So the cartoon is really fun. But for me, I like my G.I. Joe, the sci-fi light version, right? And I think what I love about it, I've heard some of the people in the comments were like, what do you mean G.I. Joe is always crazy? It's always bizarre. It's ridiculous. How can you be, angry? Like, so many of us are not into Cobra Law, right? A lot of you people might feel the same way. Like, I saw Cobra Law and I'm like, it's too dumb. It's too out of the realm of what I think a G.I. Joe should be, which is this, sci-fi military fantasy world. That I don't like it. And that was my first take on Cobra Law. And finally, I got into the figures and started playing with them because I got everything back in the day. And I do love the design. I think they have a really unique and crazy design. And I think the design in the movie is fantastic and really works as a world. If you saw like a Frazetta painting of the Cobra Law shit, it would look like something from Weird Fantasy. It would look like it would fit in really well. And it has like a retro, cool, bizarre look to it that doesn't that a lot of knockoffs of sci-fi now just don't achieve that clever or interesting. So I actually do like Cobra. I do like Cobra La for that purpose, but for me they were too far. I'm going to argue for sci-fi light, okay? And here's why I think that the comic book wins for me. And a lot of the things that are Larry Hama notoriously, if he didn't like an element that Hasbro threw at him, refused to use it. So the things like you'll say, well, there's battle android troopers. I'm like, yeah, we're gonna have those in like a day. I mean, we are like on the verge of having battle android troopers right now. You get those like weird, creepy robotic dog things, and I mean that is like barely science fiction. DNA. I mean, they clone sheep. Could they clone, Genghis Khan and combine them with a bunch of other things? No, but that's why I think it's sci-fi light. It's just a slight advancement of where we are and what is believable. It doesn't have to be believable. I don't want to, it's a children's toy and it's a cartoon and a comic book. It doesn't have to be believable. But for me, it's like, I don't know why there's this need to go crazy and bring in all of these science fiction elements into a thing that isn't in itself fascinating. We have terrorist organization with tanks and, ships and rattlers and every kind of weapon imaginable. We got ninjas, we've got soldiers, we've got all kinds of, combat. We've got every kind of vehicle known to man. All that is perfectly enough for me that I do not need anything more than a laser gun here or there. Obviously, we have a whole team as the protagonist, and any one of them might be the protagonist in the course of the story. But the man in charge is, in the comic book, is Snake Eyes, is the man, the protagonist, I think, of G.I. Joe. In the comic book is Snake Eyes. In the cartoon, we get a much more of a mix of characters that take turns as protagonists, but I would say if you had to favor one, there's Duke. And again, here I'm going to give the edge to the comic book. This is why I think Snake Eyes is a way better protagonist than Duke, and is also should be with Scarlet, right? So this is the other thing is, who's with Scarlet? Who gets Scarlet? Well, in the comic book, Snake Eyes and Scarlet are a pair. They're an inseparable, be unimaginable to think of them as being with anybody else. And in the cartoon, there's a light hint that Duke and Scarlet are together, and some people will debate. Here's why I think Snake Eyes is a way better protagonist than Duke. Duke is a fairly generic character. He's okay. He's a strong leader type, right? But he's pretty much like Matt Tracker from Mask. He's the predictable leader, hero, and therefore doesn't stand out as being fascinating or interesting as the lead of a story. That, he's the lead, that the same lead as you'd have in every story. In the comic book, for our story, we pick a mute, faceless, deformed, lost his face a guy with a tragic past, and we dressed all in black and we never see him. That's your hero. I mean, how unusual is that to have a story where that is your main character, somebody can't speak, can't see his face, can't express his face, and it works. It's absolutely fascinating. Now we add in that he's in love with, he's this love of his life, this woman who's like with him and stands by him, even though you got no face, right? And that love story is so much more fascinating. So I'm going to give the comic book one better protagonist and better love story, and so that goes to the comic book for the win. Let's go into the villains. Cobra Commander. Okay, I'm going to get repetitive. You're going to see where I'm coming from here. So what do you think? I really want to know. This is what I think. This is my opinion. This is my opinion, not law here. What do you think? What do you like better? I hate Cobra Commander in the cartoon. He's annoying. All he does is surrender. All he does is run away and scream. He's irritating. Retreat! 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 Then we find out he's a weird snake person. He's just an irritating character. He's pretty useless, and he's not really a threat. Let's contrast him with the Cobra Commander of the comic book. The Cobra Commander of the comic book is a stone cold gangster. He is terrifying. He's a sociopath. He will stab you in the back. He will kill his own son. He actually does try to kill his own son several times. Blows up his, son, makes his son lose his limbs and his eye. A madman that, created this cult and brought it into a, worldwide, into a international terrorist organization, which is kind of amazing. Try to imagine the Cobra Commander of the cartoon creating that terrorist organization, and it doesn't make any sense, right? So, but where we know the Cobra Commander of the comic book builds it from scratch. He is not a rich man. He's a used car salesman. He builds it from a charismatic personality. He's a sociopath. He's power hungry, and he's ruthless and brilliant. And that is the comic book's version of Cobra Commander, much preferred to the cartoon. So, the Cobra Commander is a way better character. In general, all of the villains are much more ferocious, much more interesting, and devastating. For instance, Storm Shadow in the cartoon gets his ass kicked by Quick Kick in like 2 minutes. In the comic book, he wastes Quick Kick pretty easily, which I think probably makes more sense. Zartan is a much more deep and interesting character in the cartoon. Now, the couple villains that actually come off both good in the cartoon and the comic book, Destro is always a pimp. Destro is always a pimp. He's a pimp in the comic book. He's a pimp in the cartoon. He's a badass all the time. But he's a much more complex and interesting, rich character in the cartoon. I mean, in the comic book, he's a much more rich and interesting character. He's got this really interesting love affair going on with the Baroness, which I think is like central to his storyline and sort of a driving force for him. He's got honor. And so there's much more depth and much more of an interesting take on the characters in the comic book. And so I'm going to give the edge of where Cobra is, what Cobra is like, once again, is going to go to the comic book. The G.I. Joe team. Let's compare the comic book versus the cartoon. In the comic book, you get very small glimpses of other characters that show up for a minute or two and go on missions, but have very little story arc. Exceptions here and there. Grunt has a pretty great story arc. Retires and he gets married and then gets kidnapped, and his wife comes and rescues him. And then it really focuses on its main cast. I would say it loves Larry Hama loves ninjas. He loves Snake Eyes and Scarlet and Storm Shadow and Zartan. In addition to the ninjas and going ninja crazy, Larry Hama also loves Destro and the Baroness and gives them so much lore, and he loves Zartan. So those are the characters that we see. In addition to that, Stalker is a much more of a major character in the comic book and is, I would say, one of the top tier characters in the comic book, whereas in the cartoon, he barely shows up at all. So, and here's where I think that's your main cast, really. It's a very different main cast. You can tell, like, Larry Hama he's writing the ones he likes. He's writing about the characters he likes, and he likes Snake Eyes. I mean, he's talked about how where he actually patterns characters after people he knows, because that helps him keep track of the character. He doesn't have to have it consistently in his head, because he just remembers, oh, this is my friend. This is my friend David, and David acts like this, and that he's basically created most of the characters based on people he knows, and Scarlet is based on his wife. So I would say that there's a pretty good guess that Snake Eyes is the character that he identifies with the most. And so we're seeing just tons of Snake Eyes, and that's great, and I love that, and that makes the comic book deep. But here's my one problem with it. We get so much of these characters, we barely get any of the others. And so here in the cartoon now, where I get most of my characterization from my favorite characters that are not Snake Eyes, Scarlet, Stalker, right, and Storm Shadow, and Destro, right? Where I get my the main characterization, like how do we, what's your characterization? The way you think of Shipwreck, and the way I think of Shipwreck is Jack Nicholson from The Last Detail, right? He's got a Jack Nicholson voice. He's kind of smarmy. He kind of hits on ladies. He's into the ladies, and he's kind of a pirate. He acts like a pirate, and that is all cartoon, right? That's all cartoon. Bazooka and Alpine, they're the comic duo of the G.I. Joe team, right? Bazooka is kind of dumb. He's just, I don't know what to say. He's a little slow. He's a little slow on the uptake, and he's got his friend Alpine. That's Alpine and Bazooka. Duke, every conception we have of Duke really comes from the cartoon. Duke is barely in the comic book at all. He barely does anything. He's really just sort of team leader. He shows up here and there. He barks commands. He has a couple of interesting character arcs later in the series, but he doesn't do a lot. Roadblock Roadblock, I would say, is one of the few characters that gets both screen time in cartoon and comic book. And now if you look at the cartoon, those characters that we love so much in the comic book are kind of missing. Snake Eyes is not that big of a deal after season 1. Scarlet's always there. Roadblock's always there. But Stalker's barely has a presence. Whereas characters like Shipwreck and Alpine and Bazooka and characters that are just completely missing from the comic book. Spirit and Quick Kick are major characters in the cartoon and barely show up at all in the comic book. In fact, Quick Kick dies very early on and he's not even around. So for characterization here, I'm gonna have to give a little bit of an edge to the cartoon because it gives you that iconic characterization. That's a lot of the way that we perceive the characters and the way that we I think interact with the character really comes from the cartoon. And so there begs the question, what is canon? If the comic book hits it on all cylinders in the way of having the most fascinating story and hitting the right note of science fiction and portraying Cobra in a way which is actually a threat and fascinating, and there's death and there's destruction, sure, that could be the canon, but then the canon misses Quick Kick. It has no spirit. It has no... So for me, I think the canon can't be any one thing. It has to be a combination, a fusing together. And the reality of it is the canon is really probably you playing with the thing when you were a kid. That's what created the canon. Right, that's what for all of us is, and that might seem like a dumb. Okay, well, how can that be? How could we have collectively created the canon? Well, we argue like that. I think there's two characters that are very much similar: Boba Fett and Firefly. Boba Fett, everybody loved him, everybody wanted him, everybody wanted more story, everybody wanted to see behind the mask, everybody wanted. Where did that come from? He does nothing in the movie. He basically kind of dies like a bitch. And has one fight scene and then gets swallowed by the Sarlacc pit. So what created him as this iconic character? We did. You sitting there playing with the thing when you were 10 years old or whatever, you created that character. It was in your head. You owned it, right? And I think the same thing with, and taking the, I think our version of Boba Fett in G.I. Joe is Firefly. Right? Firefly, same thing. Zero presence in the cartoon. He's kind of a joke in the cartoon. Very little presence in the comic book until much, much later, and they kind of don't do him that well. Yet everybody's favorite villain. Like just what, at least he's in your top 5 favorite villains of all time, right? As far as what created him, his look, what you did with him. And so I think ultimately the canon can't be the cartoon or the comic book. It has to be a combination of the comic book, the cartoon, the file cards, all which contradict, and you playing with them. That is my pitch, that it's all canon, and so none of it is, I guess. What do you think? What's the canon for G.I. Joe? Can it have canon? Tell me in the comments below. Oh, and like and subscribe and all that crap. Yeah.